It's just not fair, John Hanson thought as he lit a cigarette and inhaled. The smoke was harsh in his lungs. A stocky man with a shaved head and a neck like a pack of ballpark francs, he was sitting at a battered table shaped like a circle. On one side was a heavily draped window framed in late afternoon sunshine. On the other was a twin-sized bed on which two uniformed police officers sat side by side, looking bored. They were both big, bald, and clad in black vests with Dade County Police on the backs in yellow. They could have been brothers, John thought. His brothers, for he too was pudgy and bald. Across the table from him, Larry Johnson, a small, wiry man with pale red hair, took a long sip from a can of Coke and sighed contently as he set it down on the table. He reminded John of those old Pepsi commercials. Ah, refreshing. "What time is it?" Larry asked. John checked his watch. 5:01. They were presently in room 266 of the Best Western overlooking I-95. If John slid aside the curtain, he would be able to see the highway, the crystal blue water beyond, and Fashion Island in the distance. Its skyline dominated by tall retail buildings. It wasn't the best area in Miami, but it wasn't the worst either. You could reasonably expect to walk outside after dark and not get shot, so that put it head and shoulders above many other parts of the city. They had been there most of the day, calling escorts from a long list they had compiled over the past several weeks. So far, of the 10 they had called, 3 came. Many of them didn't like when John mentioned sex and money over the phone and refused to come. They were the older heads. They knew how to cover their asses. A lot of people thought escorts were different from prostitutes. They'd imagined some stunningly beautiful lady showing up to the hotel room of a rich businessman and then going out to dinner and a show with him, but it rarely went down like that. She came, they fucked, and she left. With money, of course. It's not fair. John thought back to the 3 women they had already arrested that day. One was 19, young and pretty. One was 32, attractive, and the last was 45, old, broken down, and resigned. She took it like a champ, laughing and joking even with her hands cuffed behind her back. The first cried like a baby, probably her first time going down, though he never said so out loud. John felt sorry for the girls. They weren't bad people. Some of them were addicts, others were just poor, and others still were stupid and had let their boyfriends talk them into it for extra money. Most of them had no other skills, no prospects, no family, nothing but hooking. They were just doing what they had to do to survive. It was the pimps they should be going after, the men who enslaved and exploited the hookers, the guys who sent their girls out and then came back later to rob the John, the assholes who beat and terrorized the girls under their purview. John looked at his watch. 5:06. The latest girl, Candy, was scheduled to be there at 5:10. Pursuing her pictures on skipthegames.com, where a lot of girls advertised, John was taken by the look in her eyes. She was posed sexily on a bed, looking over her shoulder, long, slim, and dark-haired. She was beautiful, utterly beautiful, except for her eyes. They were vacant, dull, cloudy. The eyes of a dead fish lying on the shoreline, so close to the water's edge, but so goddamn far. She was probably a junkie, so addled on the shit her pimp fed her to keep her docile that she didn't even know what day it was. Name of the game, John told himself. He'd been a vice cop for 10 years and he'd seen it all. Even so, looking into the broken eyes of poor, pretty Candy, rage welled up inside of him. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair, and it shouldn't be happening. Presently, a soft rap came at the door, and the 2 cops on the bed jerked in unison. Larry, his eyes going wide, jumped up from his chair and pulled his gun out. John got up and came around the table without taking out his own sidearm. The last thing the poor girl needed was a piece jammed into her face. The 4 of them met at the door. They had been through the whole sad process so many times now that none of them needed to speak. John flanked one side of the door and Larry the other. The two cops backed up until there was a 5-foot gap between them and the door. Nodding to Larry, who nodded back, John opened the door and stepped back. "Dade County Police," he said, the sunshine blinding him. "Come inside." For a moment, Candy, backlit against the pounding light, didn't move. John opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could utter any words, the woman fell forward, crashing limply to the floor. Heart pounding, John dropped to one knee and rolled her over. She was dead. The precinct building, housed in a terracotta structure overlooking the ocean, buzzed with activity. John sat at the desk he and Larry shared while Larry went off to the vending machine for a snack. Phones rang. People murmured. A tight ball of hot pain had begun to form in the center of John's forehead, and he massaged it with his thumb and forefinger. "You all right?" Larry asked when he returned. He was carrying a bag of Lay's potato chips, a bag of mixed nuts, and a 100 grand bar. "I'm fine," John lied, shifting in his chair. Since returning from the motel, he had been staring at Candy's records on the computer and thinking about her, the way she flopped down dead for no apparent reason. He was certain toxicology would find drugs in her system, but that didn't explain why. John had seen people OD before. They rarely flopped limply over and died. They shook, they thrashed, they gurgled and clawed at their throats and faces. They didn't just stop. "So, what's the story with our girl?" Larry asked. Sitting up straight, John said, "Real name's Allison Stone, 29, from Daytona Beach. She was arrested once in 2015, again in 2017, and one more time in 2019. After that, she dropped off the map." A lot of working girls were like rock bands. They regularly went on tour. If a pimp wasn't happy with what his girl was making in Miami, he'd take her to Cali, or New York, or Richmond, Virginia. It wasn't rare, then, for a girl to disappear. A cursory check showed that she hadn't been picked up anywhere else, so it was possible that she had never left Miami. "She have a pimp?" Larry asked. "Alfonso Jones," John said. Larry cocked his head. "The guy who shot Jerry Mansfield?" John nodded. A low-level crip, Jones shot and nearly killed a patrolman named Jerry Mansfield during a routine traffic stop in 2020. After he was taken in, they found coke, heroin, and crack sequestered in the trunk, enough to keep half the city high for a week. He was eventually linked to the Mexican mob. The story gained national attention. "He went down a year ago," Larry said. "That means she's indie now?" John sighed. "I don't know." Larry was just about to say something else when the door to the captain's office opened and Captain Decker stuck his hand out. "Hanson, Johnson, come here." John rolled his eyes. Great. Decker had been the man in charge for less than a year, but in that time he had reamed more asses than Ron Jeremy. If he wanted to see them, chances were it wasn't for a good time. Decker's office was dim and tastefully appointed, with potted plants, framed photos, and antique furniture arranged carefully here and there. A tall, thin man, vaguely Middle Eastern, or Eastern European, Decker held himself with the pride of a king. He nodded as John and Larry sat, and then took his own seats with a regal flourish. John's dislike of the man was almost total. "I got some big news on your girl," Decker said. "Candy." John and Larry looked at each other. "Already?" Decker nodded. "Allison Stone. Would you believe she's already dead?" The words struck John as odd. Already dead? Of course she was already dead. John held her body in his lifeless arms less than 3 hours ago. Yeah, I believe it," John said. "After all, I saw it." Decker chuckled dismissively. "I mean, she was already dead when she showed up to your room." John's confusion deepened. Next to him, Larry looked like a stupid child concentrating on a particularly difficult math problem. Delighting in their bafflement, Decker went on. Allison Stone died last year. A couple kids found her in a lot. She was strangled. Understanding dawned on John. You mean she was dead before she answered the call? Decker nodded. Long before. But that's impossible. Decker shrugged. That's what the records say. Then that wasn't Allison Stone. Forensics is on it now, Decker said. We'll know by midnight. Either way, looks like you two have stumbled upon a genuine mystery. A mystery, Decker explained, that would be handed off to homicide. Later, as he piloted his Lincoln through the darkened streets of Miami shores, passing the fashionable shops and cafes all shuttered for the night, John ran the case over in his mind, examining it from every angle, the way an archaeologist would a strange rock. Allison Stone was dead. Had been. Yet the woman who showed up at the motel had Stone's ID, and looked just like her. Of course, it couldn't be her. That was ludicrous. Then again, he remembered her eyes. Didn't he himself liken them to something dead? A fish. He remembered the call he placed to her. She answered on the third ring with a robotic, "Hello." When he made the offer, she simply said, "Yes." He gave her the address, and she said, "Okay." Monosyllables. 2 hours later, tossing and turning in bed, John got up and went downstairs to his desktop, which he kept in his office. He powered it up and made himself a drink while he waited. When it was on, he logged on to Skip the Games and went to Allison's ad. Below the photo and details, other ads by the same user appeared. Ads that neither he nor Larry had checked, since the most recent was last week, and the whole point of the operation was to take in the most active girls. Heart inexplicably pounding, John clicked one of the links, and it took him to an ad for a black girl named Charlie. The sole photo showed a pretty, light-skinned woman lying on a cot in a bare, dirty room. Her eyes were dead, glassy. John clicked back and clicked the next link. An overweight Hispanic woman stood before a drab backdrop, her breasts hanging freely from her black dress. She, too, looked dead. 2 more ads yielded the same result. A woman who looked more like a zombie than a living person. Her eyes white and milky, and her face wan. Each one contained the same caption. For an unforgettable experience, call. John didn't sleep very well that night. And when he did, he dreamed. The next morning dawned bright and hot. At the precinct, John parked his Lincoln in the underground garage and took the elevator to the vice offices on the 5th floor. Larry was already at the desk, and when John walked up, he said, "Captain wants to see us. Says it's important." Sitting before his throne like the lord he thought he was, Decker wasn't his usual self. He looked pale, tired, anxious. "That was Allison Stone, all right," he said without preamble. "Fingerprints, dental records, all match." Something slick and greasy moved through John's stomach. "I was doing a little research last night," he said, "and I found something." Using Decker's computer, he brought up Skip the Games and showed him the ads. "They all have the same expression in their eyes," Decker said thoughtfully. "They're obviously working for the same guy," John said. "They were all posted by the same person. A couple of them even offered 2-girl specials." Decker sighed. "All right, we know that. But what the hell about Allison Stone?" John thought about it. Finally, he said, honestly, "I don't know. Maybe she wasn't dead." Decker looked at him. The city medical examiner pronounced her dead. She was dead. He stared off into space for a moment. I'm gonna see if we can exhume her. I hope to God she's in that grave. Back in their desk, John opened a drawer, removed a notepad, and dialed a number. Who you calling? Larry asked. Chelsea Harper. An hour later, John knocked on the door of a no-name motel on the edge of Liberty City, one of Miami's most terminal slums. The buildings on either side of the building were decayed and boarded up. The houses along the opposite side of the street were dirty and crumbling, and the pavement running past them was cracked and overgrown in some places by weeds. Standing at the door, waiting to be let in, he felt exposed. He regretted not letting Larry tag along. After the third knock, the door opened, and a small, thin, white woman with blonde cornrows and golden teeth appeared. Her thin arms were crisscrossed with mediocre tattoos. Across here, a name there. She wore a white tank top, through which her nipples poked, and a pink pair of shorts. Her pudgy stomach hung slightly over the waistband, her navel set with a silver piercing.
Well, hi there, Detective Hanson,
she said in a faux seductive voice.
Come on in.
Nodding his greeting, Hansen stepped into the room. The carpet was dirty and littered with trash. The walls were splattered with grease and God knows what else. The single bed was unmade, the sheets filthy, and a strange smell hung heavy in the air. John fought to keep from gagging. Chelsea plopped down on the bed and drew a long, skinny cigarette from a crumpled pack. Plopping it between her lips, she lit it and inhaled.
What do you want?
She asked, dropping the act. I just want to ask a few questions, okay? John had known Chelsea Harper for 3 years. He busted her in a sting much like the one from the previous day. He got her to turn on her pimp, and, though the law didn't approve, he paid her cash for information. He figured it was safer that way. The names of official informants were kept on a list downtown. A list that can be, and had been, hacked. Tapping her cigarette against the red plastic ashtray on the nightstand, Chelsea shrugged.
Go ahead.
Taking the manila envelope out from under his arm, he opened it and took out the photos he'd printed before leaving the station. He laid them down on the bed. Do you know any of these women? Chelsea leaned over and studied the photos. When she got to the last one, she jerked as though struck.
That's Robin,
she muttered. The photo in question was the one of the light-skinned black woman. You know her? John asked, something like hope rising within him.
I did,
she said.
But...
What? She shook her head.
I shouldn't even say anything. Tell me.
Chelsea looked up. John was taken aback by the expression on her face. She was afraid.
I can't.
John pulled out his wallet. I have $500 here, he said. You can have it. Just tell me. Please. I need to know. Chelsea looked from the wad of bills in his hands to his face, her tongue darting out reptilian-like. 500 was a lot of money.
All right,
she said. Tell me. Chelsea finished her cigarettes and lit a fresh one.
3 months ago, this guy came around.
Chelsea and Robin White, the black woman from the photo, worked the area around the Martin Luther King Jr. Plaza Metro Rail station, turning tricks for commuters on their way home from work. One night in June, they were standing on a corner when a man approached them. It was dusk. Many of the streetlights in the area don't work, so the man seems to move always in shadows. Chelsea described him as tall, thin, and black, wearing a top hat, sunglasses, and cutaway tails.
Looked like he was on his way to a dinner party.
When the man spoke, his voice was warm and smooth. Chelsea said he sounded Jamaican. He offered both girls to work in my employ, but they both turned him down.
He was a real creep,
Chelsea said, shuddering.
His clothes were dirty, and he stank.
She also said he was cold. When he appeared, the temperature seemed to dip. A couple days later, Chelsea was walking the beat when she came across Robin standing by an abandoned building.
I called her, but she didn't act like she heard me. When I got up close, I patted her on the shoulder, and she turned around.
Robin's eyes were milky white. Her jaw hung slack.
She was cold, too. Her skin felt like ice.
Robin worked her normal beat for 3 days before moving on.
The other girls avoided her. Something wasn't right with her, and it scared us.
2 weeks later, the man appeared to her again, this time while she was in her room.
Someone knocked on the door, and I opened it. He was standing there, grinning. His face was so, I don't know, bony, like he was dead. He asked if he could come in, and I slammed the door.
You haven't seen him since?
No, but I saw Robin a couple times.
Where?
This house on 83rd Street, by the park. I saw her go inside.
What's this guy's name? Did he ever tell you? Chelsea nodded.
Sammy, I think. Baron Sammy.
Which house? Chelsea sighed.
Big abandoned one. Looks haunted.
Johnny handed her the money. If you see this guy again, call me. John spent the rest of the afternoon at his desk, typing and retyping Chelsea's account from memory. When it was done, he read it, trying to make sense of it all. A guy named Baron Sammy showed up, tried to get Chelsea and her friend Robin to work for him, and when they refused, Robin wound up like she was. He had to have done something to her. Drugged her, maybe. The more he read the description of Sammy, however, the more confused he became. Chelsea made him sound like a vampire or something. Could she be trusted? Was she feeding him bullshit? Possibly, though in 3 years she had never once steered him wrong. On a hunch, he typed Baron Sammy into the database, but found nothing. No charges, no convictions, not even a license. Switching to Google, he retypes the name. The first result was for a Baron Samedi. John clicked on it. Next to a painting of a tall, thin, black man with a top hat and sunglasses, the text read, Baron Samedi is a mythical figure in voodoo folklore, serving as a type of grim reaper. He is said to accept souls into death, and can also resurrect them. Allison Stone. John flopped back in the chair and rubbed his face with his hands. Allison Stone was dead. No, he cautioned himself. That's not possible. Lost and hating it, he got up from the desk and went over to the water cooler by the main doors. He grabbed a cup, filled it about halfway, and was just lifting it to his lips when a tall, black man in a top hat walked past in the hall. For a second, John didn't make the connection, but when he did, his heart leapt. He dropped the cup and pushed through the doors. Up ahead, the man rounded a corner and disappeared. John followed. When he reached the same corner only a second later, the corridor was completely empty. That night, John barely slept. At first, he sat up in the living room trying to lose himself in an old movie on AMC. John Wayne rode hard across the arid California Badlands in pursuit of the man who killed his father. When it was over, another came on. John Wayne in World War II, fighting the evil Japanese in the jungles of a nameless tropical island. He thought of Allison Stone and Robin White, of Baron Samedi and the man he thought he'd seen in the hall. He thought of the house Chelsea Harper had told him about, the one that looked haunted. At some point he must have turned the TV off and fallen asleep, for when he woke in bed, his heart crashing and sweat standing on his forehead, thin Muted light streamed through the window, bathing the room a murky gray. Samedi. In his dream, the black man had come to him, the bedroom door swinging creakily open. For a long moment he stood in the shadows. All John could see were his glowing red eyes. Then he came forward. His face was a skull. His hands were hooked into talons. He fell on John, and that's when he woke. In the bathroom, he checked his body for any telltale sign that Samedi had actually visited him. But, of course, he found nothing. It was only a dream. Looking into his haggard reflection, however, he knew what he had to do. First, he called in sick to work. Decker gave him hell, but he didn't care. Next, he drove over to Liberty City. The house was an old Victorian, with gingerbread trim across from Arcola Lakes Park. It was grimy, run down, and decomposing. It had to be the one Chelsea told him about. He drove past it and turned around, parking along the sidewalk. Trees and a wrought iron fence marked the southern border of the park. Acting as though he were texting, he pulled out his phone and studied the facade of the house. A flagstone walk led to the porch. Skinny, emaciated trees dotted the wide front yard. He saw no signs of life. After 10 minutes, he left and returned home. He checked Skip the Games and went through the ads Samedi had posted. Next, he called Larry. "I'm onto something big with the stone case," he said.
What? Is that what you called out?
"Yes. Don't tell Decker."
Look, if you need some help.
"No. I have to do this alone. Just sit tight." He didn't tell him that he would be breaking the law. Larry was a good guy. John didn't want to place that burden on his shoulders. When he was done, he hung up and went into the kitchen. He was just beginning to boil a pot of coffee when he noticed a dusty black hearse creeping along the street bordering his backyard. It came to an intersection, stopped, and turned left, driving out of sight. It seemed like an omen, but such things could not be, could they? Midnight. John loaded a long black duffel bag into the back of the Lincoln and drove to Liberty City. His stomach rolled anxiously, and several times on the trip he considered turning back around and going home. What he was planning on doing was illegal. It could cost him his career and possibly his freedom. He thought of all the girls he had seen in Samedi's pictures, the milky eyes, broken faces, crushed spirits. He didn't care if it was illegal or not. Someone had to stop this, and stop it now. He passed the Victorian and parked on 14th Avenue, which flanks the western edge of the park. He grabbed his bag from the back seat and walked back toward the house, keeping in the shadows. When he was in total darkness, he slipped into the backyard of a small ranch and moved low and quick, eventually coming to the back of the Samedi house. Candlelight burned in a first-floor window. Crouching behind a tree, his breath coming in quick, hot gasps, John unzipped the bag and pulled out a shotgun with an underbarrel flashlight attachment, a black ski mask, and a small pouch containing an assortment of burglary tools. For nearly 15 minutes, John sat against the gnarled trunk of the tree, tossing the occasional glance at the house. The light emanated from what he took to be the kitchen, or maybe a parlor. His stomach rolled. He wasn't ready for this. Even so, he got to his feet and moved quickly to the back of the house, running in a half-crouch. When he reached the lighted window, he dropped and waited to catch his breath. Getting to his knees, he lifted his head over the sash and peered through the thin, moth-eaten lace curtain. 2 women stood in an empty living room, their heads slack and their arms at their sides. Another woman lay on the floor, naked, her arms stretched out on either side of her. He could just make out the tattoo on her leg. An eagle. Chelsea Harper. As if on cue, Samedi entered the room from stage right, a tall, imposing figure in a long coat and hat. In one hand, he held a dagger. Oh God, no time for the tools. John went to the back door, kicked it in. The sound was titanic in the empty house, the force kicking a cloud of dust into the air. A kitchen. Light spilled through an archway. John pushed himself forward, came to it. Samedi was facing him, a smile on his thin lips. It all seems to have happened over a span of minutes, but couldn't have taken longer than 10 seconds, if that.
Detective,
Samedi said with evident delight. His voice was smooth and rich, like summer honey. On the floor, Chelsea thrashed and made strangled noises. A rag had been wadded and shoved into her mouth. "Get on your knees," John yelled, shoving the shotgun towards Samedi. Samedi simply stood there, grinning. In the faint lick of firelight, his face was drawn and gaunt. His eyes seemed too big for their sockets. His coat was ratty, dirty, and fraying. Though the night was warm, John could feel a chill in the air. A musty, unnatural, dank cold, like the kind one would feel in a cavern or the grave.
I don't think I will, Detective.
Samedi said now.
And I think you'll do well not to threaten me.
"On your knees, or you're dead," John yelled. He took a step into the room, but Samedi didn't fall back, didn't flinch.
You don't seem to understand, Detective. I cannot be killed.
He took a step forward, then, and John fired. The force drove Samedi back and knocked him down, leaving him in a heap. The two women snapped awake then, their eyes glowing white. Samedi twitched, stirred, lifted his head.
Seize him.
Suddenly, they were all around him. A dozen women with cloudy eyes and gnashing teeth, their fingers clawed and tearing, strangled moans rising from their throats. One grabbed him from behind, and he rammed the stock of the shotgun into her stomach. Another came at him from the left. Unthinkingly, he swung around and fired. A massive hole appeared in her chest. Terrified now, he turned, and one of the girls clawed his face, while another went for his arm. The shotgun dropped, discharged, driving 3 of the women back.
No.
Samedi wailed. John was reaching for his pistol now, his hands trembling. There were too many of them, though. One, a black woman, threw herself at him, and he tumbled back, knocking into a nightstand. Suddenly, the ratty curtains were ablaze. John pulled the pistol and shot the black woman in the head. A tiny red hole appeared, and she dropped. On the floor, Chelsea screamed. John turned just as Samedi hit him. The force drove them both through the window in a shower of glass. When he hit the ground, John's breath rushed out of him.
How dare you attack my girls?
Samedi pulled back one fist and hit John in the face. Lights exploded in his field of vision. Another blow. The world was starting to go gray. The gun. It was still in his hand. As Samedi pulled back for another punch, John shoved it against his stomach and fired. The force knocked Samedi aside. For a moment, John lay motionless on the ground, fighting to catch his breath. The sky was black and star-splashed, and he briefly considered falling asleep before he remembered the Baron. Getting to his feet, coughing and wincing with pain, John saw Samedi lying on the ground, his back hunched. He's dead. The fucker's dead. Savage glee coursed through him. He staggered to Samedi's side and pushed the son of a bitch over with one foot. His face was white and drawn, but his eyes were open, and he was smiling. John raised the pistol. Samedi opened his mouth, and darkness rushed out. Evening, New Orleans. A bald, pudgy white man shuffles through the gas-lit French Quarter, his eyes dull and cloudy. A car pulls to the curb, its headlights on. The passenger window buzzes down and a man's face appears. "How much?" he asks, turning stiffly. John Hanson, missing from Miami for 2 months, ambles over and gets in.